Hey guys, welcome to the Deeper Bible Podcast. We're a show dedicated to uncovering the profound beauty of God's Word and leveraging its wisdom for life in our fast-paced world. And today, we're going to be talking about justice. What is this thing called justice? Who gets to decide? How is it implemented in the world? We're going to try to do justice to this complex, controversial topic called justice. We'll just say straight out of the gate, this is a hard topic. And not only hard to think about, it's hard to be a just person in this world. This is something wise people, brilliant people for a long time have been thinking about. And listen to a guy 400 years before Jesus, name's Plato. He and his teacher Socrates, they're talking with some friends about, is it better to actually be a just person or only to seem to be just, to sort of like look like you're a moral person? And here's what this guy Glaucon says. Listen to this. 400 years before Jesus, he says this: the just man, the just person, will be scourged, racked, chained, have his eyes burned out, and at last, after every kind of misery, he will be crucified. He will be set up on a pole. And then he will know that one ought to wish not to actually be just, but only to seem just. So 400 years before Jesus, this Greek philosopher realized that, if you're actually brutally, truly just, you're going to end up on a cross, actually. And so today we're going to do a wide-ranging conversation about what different people have thought about justice, but really squaring in on the cross, on the justice of God, on the Christian eschatological view of justice that looks, we'll talk about it, that looks at a very wide angle of God's plan and God's promise and how that comes to bear on our world today. So I'm here with my friend Destiny Kennedy. And Destiny, welcome. And
hey guys,
let's get into it. Let's talk about justice.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think a helpful place to start with justice is beginning to attempt to define what justice means. So maybe we can walk through some basic definitions, some angles that some people have taken on justice before, and then go from there.
Yeah, let's do that. So justice is a many-sided type thing. And so often when people kind of use the word justice and it's, put out there in political debates or op-eds or whatever, it's often not clarified what type of justice we're talking about, what aspect of justice. So for many, one classical position sees justice as a process. And I'm talking here in like a legal, political arena. Justice is everyone stands equal before the law. There is a due process of law. Everyone gets the same treatment. So it's this fair process. And the Bible is aware of this. The book of Proverbs talks at many lengths about, be sure that you don't have two types of weights and measures. Be sure that your scales are even. So the process needs to be fair. Others point out that the processes are often perverted and rigged in favor of who's ever in power or whatever. And so some would say, no, the point of justice is to ensure desirable outcomes, predetermined, desirable, countable outcomes. And we need to make adjustments in the process, whichever ones are necessary, in order to ensure those external outcomes. And the Bible's also aware of things like this, where it talks about having special eye to the poor or to the widow. Some theologians talk about this in terms of the preferential option for the poor, to say, like, look, if you have like a fair foot race, fair process, but you have somebody who's a high school sprinter and, an old guy, the old guy's going to lose every time. So is there any way that you can help him to also win the prize now and then? So, so sort of putting counterweights in the system. Many have also thought of justice as a question of distribution, like who gets what? Here's the pie. How are we going to slice up the pie? Who determines what? And is there any room for issues of merit? Like some so-and-so deserves to have more than someone else. And this is, our economic system in the West is very much built upon sort of the risk you're willing to take, the amount of work you're willing to put in, is the issue for how much you're going to get back, right? And I was reading the other day in the book of Deuteronomy where Moses is blessing the 12 tribes right before he dies, and he blesses Joseph. And it's amazing. There's this moment he says, "Oh, Joseph, the bounty of heaven and the bounty of earth, and you're going to get just so much stuff, Joseph. You're just going to get totally blessed. Here's why. Because you are Nazir Echav, which means like you're the Nazarite from among your brothers. You're the one who's taken vows of abstention or vows of holding yourself back from stuff. Yeah, exactly. You've had the hardest go here. You went through the hardest things. Therefore, you deserve the most things." And so you see how the idea of merit is there a little bit?
Yeah, demonstration of integrity through trial or difficulty, which again, I think maps on very well to American ideologies on how you build wealth, how you succeed, and that it may even almost be assumed sometimes that if you put in X, Y, or Z in terms of integrity and hard work, that you should always get out, right? Wealth building or opportunity or whatever. Whereas maybe one of the other types of justice in conversation with this is, but what if me being a particular type of person, I don't experience that, but I have put in X, Y, or Z and not gotten X, Y, or Z out. And so, yes, I'm seeing the conversations that are happening here, even just practically.
Here's an interesting example from a very practical example from Aristotle back in the day. He was the student of Plato, actually. It's another Greek thinker. And he's talking here about, let's imagine a world where there's a lot of people who want to play the flute, but there's not that many flutes to go around. There's not that I know. Okay. Not that many good flutes to go around.
It was a good analogy at some point.
How do you decide who gets the best flutes? And this is what Aristotle says. He says,
too funny.
He says the best flute player ought to be given the outstandingly good flutes. So because you have the merit of being a fantastic flute player, you should get the good flute. And then he expands from that and says, just so the claims to political office must necessarily be based on superiority in those things which go to the making of the state. The idea being that if you're good flute players, you get the flute. If you're good at the systems of politics and law and understanding that stuff, then you should get a piece, maybe a larger piece of say in how justice is arranged in society. So I'm going to do a little bit of a Bookshare. Part of the purpose of Deeper is I think of myself as like a dealer, a trafficker in ideas. And part of the purpose of Deeper is to make you aware of a lot of really, really profound things that have been said on a lot of topics. And we can only cover so much here. So I try to make you aware of the sort of like conversation orienting type discussions that for those who are interested, you can really, really go deep. So in a little bit, I'll do a good little Bookshare here. So back to our definitions of justice. We were talking about the distributive question. There's also the question of retribution. That is, how do you deal with criminals? And how do you, bad guys, how do you deal with them, you know? So, and the Bible talks about that evil has real consequences. But then others want to pivot out of that and say, actually, justice should have more of a restorative angle. It shouldn't be focused on punishment. It should be focused on restoration, the healing of damages for the victim, for the perpetrator too. And this is, conversations about criminal justice system reform are based in this idea of restorative justice. And they're looking at the wider communal angle and wider causes. Why is it that such and such became a criminal? And this is a tricky dance, because how do you maintain moral responsibility to say, even though you did have a hard go at it, nevertheless,
you've made this decision.
And you're on the hook for it.
Right.
So this is a hard thing. Of course, talking in terms of social justice is a very common thing, and usually that's pointing to the larger system realities that are bigger than any one person, and that make it, kind of tip the landscape in favor of some and against others.
Sure.
Some other people would say about social justice that it's a bit of a strange phrase, because the word justice, the concept of justice, has always meant a social phenomenon. So to talk in terms of social justice is kind of redundant because justice is social. So it doesn't even need the adjective social. That's the idea.
Yeah.
But the larger, another thing here, and here I have a Bookshare. This is from a guy named John Rawls, very famous legal theorist. This is called A Theory of Justice. This has been a very important book. And Rawls talks in terms of a veil of ignorance. And what he means is, in order to deal with the problem of human bias, the people making the rules need to act as if they're arranging society without knowing where they themselves would be in society. And that's why, Lady Justice and traditional pictures of the Greek goddess of justice and so forth, I was always blindfolded.
Right.
Because she doesn't play favorites. And so that idea of impartiality is also a very, very core idea. Of course, though, it's hard.
An ideal.
It's an ideal, exactly.
Right.
It's very hard to achieve.
It's an ought, not necessarily an is.
Yes.
And I notice as well, just emerging in our conversation, is just how many questions the idea of justice begs. Like, there are just so many. It's just like a Russian doll. Once you open this one, then there's another question that has to be answered.
Yes.
And a great deal of clarity and nuance is required to know what one ought to do in any given situation. And I think our ideas of justice are often one-dimensional, or perhaps maybe deeply connected to an ideological stance that we've experienced from a favorite politician or something like that. And what I'm hearing you say is that, and we'll get to this maybe a little bit deeper later in the episode, but I'm seeing this emerge, that there maybe in the scriptures, because of the examples you've given, all of these elements talking to one another, and somehow God is able to synthesize them in a way that works, but is also flexible enough for the day-to-day of our lives, of the shifting change of culture, of expectation, of shame and honor, things that we're not even really familiar with as a culture in America. But all sorts of things are at play. All sorts of opinions are at play. And so I just think about how much sympathy I'm experiencing now that I think of even just people who rule in institutions, who rule in government. I know we don't feel great about them very often, but this is a tough job. And I think it's just kind of rerouting me in the reality that God must be the right person for this. And I think we'll come up on this later, I'm sure. But his otherness is actually helpful when I think about that veil of ignorance, right? His otherness is helpful in that he is not a human like us with limitations, biases, agendas, even if we're not always aware of them or intentionally, trying to be motivated by them. There's this dance we do recognizing that God is so good to have given us direction in the scriptures, and then also realizing, okay, but I actually still have to make choices, and I have to make choices that align with God's view. So anyways, I think those are all just things I'm processing as I'm realizing that, like, this is some tough stuff.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And I have mad respect both for God and for the people who have to enact this, and I would say we're a part of that as the church. But again, something we'll get to later.
And we will get to that. Sarah and I love to watch legal thriller shows, and sometimes we listen to like John Grisham books together. And awesome. So like we'll often like the judge gives the verdict or whatever, or the jury does, and we'll pause the show and like talk about the different angles from it, because it's not morally clear in so many situations. And you're certainly right. What you said right at the beginning is so important, that this issue begs a lot of questions, in particular about human nature.
Yes.
What are human beings anyways? And we'll come back to that, but that's...
What are they for? Where are we going?
I think that's like one of the major unexplored questions, our assumptions surrounding human nature, because systems of justice are built based on an implicit view of what humans are and can become under the right circumstances.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, so we've done a little bit of a survey of kind of what ideas are out there. Let's take a look at what biblical justice looks like.
Yeah.
What do we as Christians, how do we define justice?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, Christians can be fruitfully involved in a lot of the discussions on the sort of categories already mentioned. They're not biblical categories per se, but there's the Bible speaks to them.
Sure.
So, the legal systems of the modern West weren't developed in a vacuum. They were actually developed in a culture heavily influenced by the Bible. And so when we find ourselves in intuitive agreement as Christians with several of these aspects, we ought to, because it actually shares a lineage. So there's that to say. So I think in sort of a sweeping statement then, in the Bible, justice is the world as it should be. And should, not is. That is, there's a gap between the way the world should be and the way humans should be, and the way humans actually are, and the way the world actually is. And the yearning for justice lives in that gap and wants to close the gap and to say, I'm not okay with the way things are. I want to be part of rectifying those things. Now, of course, one of the major issues, in fact, here's another Bookshare, very influential book by the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, is called Whose Justice? Which Rationality? So it's sort of like, oh, okay, justice. Whose are you referring to? This is an enormously complex question. And who gets to decide and so forth. So that's why for Christians, justice is the way the world should be according to God. Because as you said, God is the only judge that's actually competent to try these cases. As it says in Samuel, humans look at the outward appearance. God looks at the heart. And so so there's that. But then what about Jesus? How does he come into this? And he comes in some very important ways. The story of Jesus's death are in many ways a legal thriller of a court that went wrong and that didn't understand justice. And then so God is like the appellate judge who overturns the ruling of the lower court and says, sorry, unconstitutional, vacated ruling or whatever. And Jesus rises. Right. But the rising of Jesus, this is so key. The rising of Jesus is the vindication, the justification of the created order. That is, the fact that Jesus came in a restored physical body is God's first move in healing the world, in closing the gap from the way that it is to the way that it should be. So this is where Christian eschatology comes into view, because as we talked about in a previous episode, the end times began at Easter. And so
in light of what you just mentioned, I look at Christ then as Paul refers to him as first fruits, kind of relating that to the hope that we have as believers in Jesus being essentially maybe this might not be the right analogy, but perhaps a down payment or a promise of what is to come.
The Spirit's the down payment too. And the presence of the Spirit in the whole Hebrew Bible is often seen as the mark of the eschatological age. The end times, when God does the great thing, the Spirit will be present. And I've got another little book shared. This is called The Bible. You should check this out. Little known author named God. I think you'll enjoy it. So look one up. But listen to what Paul says in, lost the page, Romans chapter 3. He says this. He's talking about why was Jesus crucified? Well, it was to show God's righteousness, but the word in there is often translated as justice as well. To show God's righteousness, justice, so that God, he, might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So we're showing justice, and God is both just himself and sharing justice with those who have faith in Jesus.
He's playing both roles.
Exactly. So the way, so if you really want to understand this concept of justice from a biblical viewpoint, I would really suggest a good long soak in the book of Romans to understand how someone like Paul sees Jesus as achieving justice, and there's different theories of how he does this. One of them is penal substitutionary atonement. Sort of he takes our punishment as a substitute. There's verses in Romans that say that exactly, but there's verses in Romans that explore other aspects too of how Jesus is God's justice revealed. And so I think that that's an important thing for Christians to keep in mind, because we can get so focused in our culture on like specific questions of justice that we lose that bigger horizon and the bigger promise and the bigger hope that it's already actually been sort of guaranteed by God when Jesus came out of the grave.
Yep.
And so that's a big thing to keep in perspective here.
And I have a question following up on that.
Yeah.
So you're relating it to how it's multi-aspectival. I think where I find tensions is in the reality that there's conversations happening even within the Christian community about justice, and there's not always unity because of the interpretive process and the differences of the interpretive process with the scriptures. And so I think just pointing that out, not to say we can know nothing and we can accomplish nothing. I just want to recognize that sometimes there's a difficulty actually accomplishing this. And as we move on even to talking about how does this work in real life, in politics, in institutions of power, and with the application of power, like this is a conversation still happening, if that makes sense. But it doesn't mean that truth isn't present and cannot bear on our lives now. You know what I mean? I want that hope to still exist because it can, and God will. But also, if you are experiencing that tension of like, okay, sometimes I feel like this whole conversation, we're just like back and forth, even from within the Christian community.
Yeah. And here, I want to circle back to what we talked about earlier. The question of what are human beings is really, really important. And I think a lot of the, when we speak past each other, very often some have the assumption that human beings are actually limited creatures, that we can only do so much, that every potential solution is a trade-off. And there's no perfect solution. There's only trade-offs. And we're sinners. We're actually all flawed deep down. And we should just like own that. But then other people, and this is very, very dominant viewpoint of human nature in Enlightenment thinking and all the subsequent movements, is that humans are in principle perfectible. There's really no limit to what we can know. There's really, when humans are born, they're innately good, actually, and they only become evil because they're exposed to broken institutions and wicked people and so forth. And so very often, that core assumption is different. And here's a great statement, another little Bookshare, from a founding father of the United States, James Madison, who writes in the Federalist Papers, famous statement in the Federalist Paper number 51. He says this: "What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary." So here he's making this elaborate case for the nature of the American government, but he's saying, by the way, if we were all good people, this would be totally pointless. But we're not. And so the American system, as it's set up and its checks and balances, is a system of intense mutual suspicion. Everybody's suspicious of everybody else. But because we can all be expected to be self-interested, the structure holds with like counter tensions, That's the idea. Sorry, we're gonna say.
No, that makes sense.
So let me keep going then. So like a very famous, arguably the most influential Christian voice in this whole discussion is St. Augustine.
Okay.
And so Christian, what is called political theology, all roads lead to Augustine here. And his major work is called The City of God.
Yes. Yep.
And the city of God, which stands for the kingdom of heaven, is opposed to the city of the world, the city of man. And so for Augustine, politics and that sphere is a necessary evil. It's necessary. The world would be a lot worse without it. But it's also irredeemably partial. It's never going to deliver the kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. And so Christians should not be seduced into thinking that the city of the world is going to solve all the world's problems, because that will only happen when the city of God arrives. And Augustine, he's a sophisticated, complex thinker. I want to read you one great thing he says. This is in book 19. And he's talking here about power. And those who have power, those who give orders, those who are in charge of systems of justice. He says this, and I just think this is so insightful. He says, those who give orders are actually the servants of those whom they appear to command. For they do not give orders because of a lust for domination, but from a dutiful concern for the interest of others. Not with pride in taking precedence over others, but with compassion in taking care of others. Is this profound?
It's a very different vision than I think any of us are familiar with.
That's not how you're exposed to the concept of power these days?
Not these days, unfortunately. But profound.
It is. And it's a vision of servant leadership.
Yes.
In a real way.
And I just have to imagine that Augustine is taking a page from Jesus.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, obviously. But it's basically looking deep into the problematic of power and authority, mm-hmm. and actually says at its deepest, truest form, it's a form of love. Uh-huh. And that question about the relation of power and love is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested to see, you may know of people who are doing this, perhaps. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen it personally. But that idea in and of itself, I think would be very attractive to this generation. And by this generation, I don't just mean Gen Z or the young people, right. But all who are alive and engaging in the day-to-day aspects of our country's politics.
Right.
If you were to present just that idea to them,
yeah.
Maybe divorced from the, hey, this comes from the Christian perspective, but just, hey, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
I think it would be deeply attractive because people long for somebody they can not only trust and that has integrity, but that who really wants to serve them. And I think the rhetoric has been there.
Oh, yeah, hey, I'm a public servant.
I'm here for you.
Right.
That guy,
exactly.
He doesn't care about you.
Yeah.
I care about you, right?
Yeah.
But this is maybe what we were talking about earlier in the episode. It's not about appearances. This mm-hmm. is showing up. Mm-hmm. This is doing the job mm-hmm. for people at all times.
That's why Augustine has been a fruitful conversation partner for a lot of non-Christians too. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are like, okay, the Jesus thing, but this guy's smart and has been very helpful. And I want to point to another person who's like a modern Augustinian. Mm-hmm. who has been enormously influential. His name is Reinhold Niebuhr. Mm-hmm. He's often considered one of the greatest, certainly the greatest American theologian of the 20th century. He's a big deal. Mm-hmm. And he's soaked in Augustine. And he's got he's written a lot of different books on politics, power. He's got a book called Moral Man and Immoral Society, in which he talks about the fact that humans in groups will always do things that are more immoral than humans in the singular will ever do. And he's also got a book called The Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, in which he says, beware the sons of light, by which he means those people, those groups that see themselves as the chosen, the anointed, the children of light, those mm-hmm. who have arisen above the human condition. You must always beware them. And he's prolific, and he's got actually in his book The Nature of Man, he has chapter 10 is called Justitia Originalis, original justice, and it's a profound treatment of the nature of justice, both before the fall, before sin entered, and now, as we have a sort of a faint memory of what real justice is, but we can't quite achieve it. And he has this great exploration of how when love fully arrives, justice will be no more. Because there
Yes.
will no longer be that gap between the is and the ought. Love is what says there ought not to be a sense of ought. There ought not to be that gap. And so when it's closed, love both fulfills and negates all historical systems of justice. And he says, no system of justice can either cease in its quest for love or be unaware of its incapacity to reach love. And so he has this pretty very rich Augustinian, but up to date, up to the mid 20th century. I mean, there's a great article by a guy named Michael Novak called "Needing Niebuhr Again." It's right after Niebuhr died, and Novak talks about like how, okay, we might want to tinker with these little aspects of what Niebuhr was saying, but in the main, we got to keep Niebuhr around. By the way, Niebuhr's been pretty popular in the last 15 years. You know why? Because he's Barack Obama's preferred theologian.
Interesting.
Yeah, Obama has talked a lot about Niebuhr, which I find a little ironic. A lot of, just like everybody wants Jesus on their team.
Sure.
And they cherry pick the stuff they like. People do that with Niebuhr because Niebuhr was brutal in his critique of the modern liberal order. And I don't mean that in the sense of like electoral politics. I mean that in the sense of the Enlightenment liberal project of the last few hundred years. So liberalism in a classical sense. But anyways, there's so many resources for people who really want to think through these topics. Actually, while I'm just doing this, let me just point one more. There's actually two more books. These are really, really good books.
Great.
One is from our friend Tom Wright, who's so helpful at all times.
Yep.
This is called God in Public: How the Bible Speaks Truth to Power Today. He's actually got a book coming out in a few months called Jesus and the Powers, which is another book about Jesus in relation to the power brokers of the world. And then actually Tom Wright's tutor at Oxford is a guy, I don't think he's passed. His name's Oliver O'Donovan. This book is called The Desire of the Nations, Rediscovering the Roots of Political Theology. This is gold. This guy has an encyclopedic knowledge of the tradition. This is a profound, profound book for thinking about, from the whole Bible, the tradition of Christian thinking, for thinking through questions of, how does the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the world work? How do I understand the First Amendment, which says that there shall be, in principle, really no overlap between the kingdom of the world and the kingdom? Can I even like abide the First Amendment? So really, really important questions.
Yes, absolutely. And so in light of that reflection, I'm curious to know if we can just move into, as we close, what our role as Christians in all of this is. And I have a feeling that relates pretty directly and, directly to the eschatological framework for where we're headed.
100%. Yep.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So, yes, I got three things that I think that are important for us to bear in mind as a church, for the church in relation to justice. And the first there is think eschatologically, to understand that because of Jesus, we're not just living in the last days, we're also living in the first days. And I got this idea from Tom Wright. He talks about how really this is the beginning of new creation, life in the Spirit, and so forth. And so to understand that bigger framework is our driver for hope. It's our motivation also to suffer well. So thinking eschatologically, which is to say, understanding how Jesus affects the great turning of the age and what that means in God's larger plan and purposes for creation and for humankind.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Yeah. Does that then assume then that if living in the last days is also living in the beginning of new creation, mean then that what we do can actually accomplish ushering in, I guess, what we would describe as elements of what is to come and what has been promised?
Yeah, I like how you said that. Elements because it's not the totality.
Yes,
because very often,
I'm very careful about,
essentially,
about
what
that language.
what they often want to do is sort of remove any need for God's climactic intervention to bring the kingdom of God. Sort of like it's on us.
Right.
Let's just be good
Sure.
enough, and we'll bring the kingdom. And, you know, a very fascinating book by an historian at Notre Dame. His name's Mark Knoll. It's called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And
I've heard of it.
It's an interesting historical look at how sort of evangelical Christians in American history have thought. One of the fascinating features is prior to the Civil War, mainstream Christians all thought that we would usher in the kingdom of God.
Yep.
That it's up to us. We're just going to perfect things, and the 1,000-year reign, and Jesus will come back at the end of that. The Civil War was a theological crisis, where after we all killed each other, people said, geez, I don't think we're going to be able to bring about the kingdom. And so that's where that's where rapture thinking started to come post that. This idea that
it's got to be God.
God's got to have a radical intervention.
And he's got to come in.
And this is very similar to what happened. World War I was also a theological crisis. The whole project of optimistic progress, we're just moving forward, was radically deconstructed. And so anyways, war tends to change your thinking.
It tends to temper our, yes, absolutely.
So the next thing then I think that the church needs to keep in mind is this, to not be gullible. We could be very gullible. Couple things come to mind. One, Reinhold Niemann often said, you know, one of the greatest mistakes of moralistic Christianity is our assumption that people are as good as their slogans. That if you only just chant the right things, have the right bumper sticker, then by golly, you must be a really good person. And he's like, that is so very wrong. So not being gullible in that sense. Secondly, this is one of my favorite quotes from C.S. Lewis. This is from his book, The Screwtape Letters.
Oh, personal favorite. Love that one.
So Screwtape Letters, if you don't know, is it's a fascinating book. The narrator is a senior demon who is tutoring a junior demon through a series of letters in how to corrupt humans. And it's a great book. So what I'm about to read is in the voice of a demon talking about how to corrupt humans. Okay, so this is what he says. The use of fashions in thought is to distract the attention of men from their real dangers. We direct the fashionable outcry of each generation against those vices of which it is least in danger, and fix its approval on the virtue nearest to the vice which we're trying to make endemic. The game, this is brilliant, the game is to have them all running about with fire extinguishers whenever there's a flood, and all crowding to that side of the boat which is already nearly gunwale under. And so what he's saying is, in terms of not being gullible, he's saying, okay, society may be concerned about this justice issue or this justice issue or this justice issue, but we shouldn't be gullible to say that that's really, of course, the real issue because everyone says it's the real issue. It could be that that's the issue that we're in least danger from right now, and that the real danger comes under a complete other innocuous-sounding heading, like love or something like that. So not being gullible to sort of, Moses tells Israel, you're not going to be the tail, you're going to be the head. But I think often the church is the tail, and it's sort of like there's this like time lag between like what culture finds interesting
Deeply
in terms of justice.
reactionary.
Yeah, and we're just trying to stay relevant. But what we end up often doing is being gullible. So there's that. And then the last thing I'll say, we'll end here, is the church has to be ready to suffer. And here I'll close with some words from Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from a Birmingham jail, which is a powerful read. You can read it in half an hour, but it's really, really a powerful read. He says this: I've watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which made a strange distinction between bodies and souls, the sacred and the secular. But there was a time when the church was very powerful. It was during that period that the early Christians rejoiced when they were deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was the thermostat that transformed the mores of society. If the church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authentic ring, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th, and we might say also the 21st century. And so the church cannot be committed to these things without being ready to follow the way of the cross. And we'll close full circle back to Plato. The just person will probably end up hanging on a pole. And if we're not ready for that, then we should forget that we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're really all about justice. Then maybe we'll end here with Hebrews 12, where we're running this race with endurance, looking to Jesus, the founder, perfecter, who for the joy that was before him endured the cross. What is the joy that's before him? It's new creation. It's the world as it should be.
Right.
And
Justice.
that vision is what enables joy in the face of terrific suffering. And that is to be our muse, our true north, as we try to negotiate all these different complex things. And because at the end of the day, and this is a platitude, but it's very true, truth is not any one of these books or whatever. Truth is a person. Truth is Jesus, actually.
God in the flesh.
And if you want to live a just life, read these things. That's fine. But spend time with Jesus and follow him and learn from him. And that's the touchstone of genuine justice.
Absolutely.
So let's end there.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Destiny. Thanks, everybody. Hey, I should just say that Deeper's a ministry of the Bay Church. We're in the Bay Area, California, and we'd love to see you sometime at a service. You can join online at thebay.church or visit one of our campuses on a weekend. We're really normal people, and we try to love God and love people. So until next time, take care, my friends. Shalom, me homies.